Why is the majority of mainstream news, especially respectable news and TV and newspapers today, so utterly riddled with ideology, hit pieces, falsehood, and outright lies? From the New York Times to BBC's Evening News, where we should find reporting about what happened, we find spin and opinions that tell us what to think rather than what's going on. How did that happen? On this channel, I have attributed a lot of blame on ideological schools, especially the neocons and culture war leftism, but my guest today has a different theory. It's actually a generational issue. This is Neutrality Studies, and I'm joined today by Dr. Graham Majin, a senior lecturer in documentary journalism at Bournemouth University and the author of Truthphobia: How the Boomers Broke Journalism. Dr. Graham Majin has more than 20 years' experience working in TV news, factual filmmaking, and media production. He has been an on-screen reporter, news editor, and senior producer, including 14 years at the BBC, during which time he regularly edited the evening news for London and the South East. In his book, he had an axe to grind with journalism, and we are here to talk about that just now. Graham, thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on, Pascal.
Well, Graham, let's dive right in. You wrote this beautiful book, and you're talking about the boomers who destroy journalism. Can you give us maybe the main arguments of the book first?
Yeah, well, you touched on it just now with your very good introduction. Journalism has one job to do, Pascal. It exists to provide reliable information for us. It exists to tell us what's going on in the world. And we need that information as human beings and as citizens so that we can make good choices about everything, but perhaps ultimately political choices about who to vote for, what policies we need to survive and prosper. And journalism is not doing that anymore. Journalism is completely broken. It's a huge grand failure of journalism, and you summed it up very well yourself. When we switch on the TV news or listen to the radio or go online or open our newspaper, we can detect that what we're getting is narrative-led news. There are a series of big narratives about all the major issues, whether it's the war in Ukraine, COVID vaccines, the environment, all of the big things. There are these great big narratives, and the stories we hear on the news are chosen if they conform to the narrative, if they support the narrative. If they don't support the narrative, they're either left out of the news agenda completely, or they're supplied in a kind of way that's spun and that are unhelpful. This is what I call truthophobia. That's why I call the book Truthophobia. It seems to be, on the surface of things, a fear of truth, an inability to even understand what it is. The other thing that we see is the division of journalism, and in fact the division of society, increasingly into two rival camps, two kind of hostile tribes. So the journalism that we're talking about is what I call official journalism. A lot of people refer to that as the mainstream media. But there's grown up over the last decade or two, largely because of the internet, the availability of channels like this. There's grown up a completely alternative media, which I call unofficial journalism. And we've got something like 50% of the population get their news and information from official channels, as you said, whether that's CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, Guardian. And about 50% roughly of people get their news from unofficial sources. And these are two worlds that are just separating, with different facts, different opinions, different narratives. And there's increasingly bitter hatred between the two tribes, so that if you tell someone that, oh, I was listening to a certain podcast the other day, or listening to a certain politician or podcaster, you're likely to be met with, oh, that's a conspiracy theorist, or that's a conspiracy theory channel, or it's hate speech, it's misinformation, it's malinformation. There's complete hatred between these two tribes. So trust is collapsing in journalism. We're in a hell of a mess. We don't even really understand what truth is. We don't understand these kind of key concepts. I mean, you're on the neutrality side of things. People don't really understand what that is. I use the word impartiality and objectivity. People have kind of lost these concepts. Though it's regarded now as, oh, well, that's both sidesism. So it's the demonization of all these things. We're in a hell of a mess, and that's why I wrote the book, and that's why I called it Truthophobia.
I absolutely agree with you. That's why I wanted to talk to you. I've heard you explain these concepts on an audio podcast, and funnily enough, the interviewer there was not quite on the same page with you. But that's interesting. It made for a good listen. But let's dive into your book, because you've structured it in 4 parts, and in the first 2 parts or so, you lay out the genesis of how we went from a moment when newspapers still were beholden to basically reporting what happened and not reporting what should be the case. And you call that Victorian age journalism, or Victorian journalism, versus what comes later, boomer journalism. And I don't want to assume, but you're part of the boomer generation, right? So you're kind of speaking from a later stage of the boomer generation, because the ones you talk about are the ones who like the 1940 kind of born boomers, or late 40s boomers. And can you explain Victorian journalism and then this early rebellious boomerism and why they clash?
Yeah, so I'm kind of, we could talk all day about what the boomers are, how we define the boomer generation. So, I mean, for me, this is something I talk about in the book, but for me, it's really 1940 is the beginning. And for example, most of the Beatles were born in 1940. John Lennon, Paul McCartney were born in 1940. And for me, it ends around about 1955. So to be honest, I kind of think I was just a bit too late to be a boomer. But no, I think it's very important just to provide a little bit of background, a little bit of the history. Once upon a time, there was this thing called Victorian liberal journalism. That's what I call it. And, it wasn't perfect. In fact, it was very imperfect, and everyone knew that. There was never any kind of magical golden age where everything was, true, and that never happened. But Victorian liberal journalism was an invention, as the name suggests, of the Victorians. So it comes out of the Enlightenment and the idea of kind of reason and evidence and empiricism. And it was developed by the Victorians. And so it emerged in Britain, and the London Times was probably the first example in the early to mid 19th century of this extraordinary new type of journalism, which valued truth. And it set out as a goal. Its goal was to tell the truth. Now, how do you do that? Because it's extremely difficult, isn't it? Because we're actually very ignorant of the truth, and it's extremely difficult as human beings to know what the truth is. So they developed a methodology which journalists had to follow. The first and perhaps most important foundational thing was to distinguish between fact and opinion. That's not easy to do, but as far as was humanly possible, Victorian liberal journalism put fact on the news pages and kept opinion for the opinion pages, or the leader or editorial pages. So, there was plenty of political bias in Victorian liberal journalism, but they kept it off of the news pages. It was, you had to turn to the opinion page, and then they would tell you why things were happening. They would interpret, and so on. So that's the first thing, to separate those two things as much as is humanly possible. The second thing is that the facts, this is kind of obvious, have got to be accurate. You can't lie. You've got to have accurate facts. But actually, that's the easy bit. The bit that's harder is is accuracy plus impartiality or objectivity, which kind of very similar words. So that is the kind of distinction between telling the truth and telling the whole truth. It's not enough just to sort of provide some accurate facts. If I'm trying to sell you a car, I could tell you all sorts of facts about the car, which are accurate, but I might give you a very, very misleading picture of the car because I've omitted a lot of other things that I don't want you to know about. So that's the kind of foundation of Victorian liberal journalism and its methodology of fact versus opinion, accuracy in fact, and impartiality. Now, the boomer generation changed everything. They changed hairstyles, taste in music. They changed education. They changed morality. They had a huge cultural revolution, and they absolutely hated anything to do with the Victorians. They were a very, very powerful, very huge cohort, and I go into the detail in the book. I won't go into too much detail here, but it was a huge generational cohort, which was brought up at a time of increasing affluence. It just seemed that affluence would go on forever. And so the challenge for the boomers was to try and create a sort of utopian society. I refer to it in the book as boomertopia. And they believed that if you dismantled, if you smashed up everything the Victorians had done, all the legacy of the Enlightenment, industrial civilization, if you could just smash it up, capitalism, all these kind of things which they saw as bad, smash it up, destroy it, what I refer to as cognitive nihilism, then you would get back to a happier time when everyone could just be kind of nice to each other and we wouldn't be competing with each other. It would all just be, a wonderful utopian future. And so that's what they set out to do. They set out to smash everything up, and they smashed up Victorian liberal journalism, and they replaced it with a different type of journalism. I call it boomer journalism, and it's become official journalism. That's what we've inherited from the baby boomer generation, official journalism. And official journalism doesn't have the primary goal of telling the truth. It has the primary goal of making the world a better place. Now, I got into trouble, and you've referred to this. I got into trouble on a podcast recently for kind of describing the boomers as benevolent. And I meant benevolent in inverted commas because they believed that they were doing good. They didn't get out of bed in the morning and say, let's kind of be evil. The baby boomers thought they were building a better world. The problem is there are unintended consequences. The journalism they created was committed. So they wanted to not be a kind of impartial or neutral bystander where there's good and evil. They wanted to be committed. Take, for example, the Vietnam War. They didn't want to be impartial about the Vietnam War. They wanted to side with North Vietnam. They wanted to end the war. They wanted to end the draft. They didn't want to take part in the fighting. They were not impartial about that, and they didn't want their journalism to be. So the boomers introduced this committed kind of advocacy journalism, which was prepared to take sides, and they hated the old impartial, to them boring, dull, factual journalism. So they were motivated by good intentions. They believe themselves to be benevolent. But there are unintended consequences to that. And the journalism we've inherited is boomer journalism. And it's causing enormous trouble because it's one-sided and it's abandoned impartiality. It's abandoned objectivity. And of course, the big question, if you've got committed journalism, if you've got journalism dedicated to making the world a better place, is who gets to decide what is a better place? How are we going to make the world a better place? Who gets to choose those things? And we can talk about that as well. But that's a little bit of the background.
Yeah, and you touch on this very important issue that I believe is fundamental, and not just for journalism, but also for education and also for politics, which is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, is the old saying, right? We don't need to assume that people are evil. There is this very interesting character in Othello, Iago, who gets up in the morning and says, "Today I will do evil." Even Hitler didn't do that. Even Hitler believed he was doing the right thing, and in a very twisted and very sick way. But I think this is a better way of approaching social issues, of assuming that probably it's done by people like you and I who want to do good things, which leads to the question then, what if I'm wrong? Which is quite a horrible question. It's a very horrible question. But your book then asks that, and it kind of it makes this arc into today, where social justice warriors and all the good people who, for all the right motives, then start doing things that, when we look at them, could be horribly wrong. And we've got a little taste of that during COVID, I believe. But let's go into COVID a little bit later. Maybe let me ask you first about these. You have these 3 steps, right? 1965 to 1980, you described this as the first phase of truthphobia, when this old structure was demolished. So that's what you just talked about. And then from 1980 to 95, in your periodization, you call that the phase of tribal truth. The new building takes shape of news that shapes and makes reality. And I think that's also where Noam Chomsky's analysis of manufacturing consent comes in, or around his book was a little bit earlier, but it seems to me to go together with that analysis of yours. And the third then is the phase of official truth, completion and consolidation, of when we are back to who makes the news. The government makes the news, and then the newsrooms report it to you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, there's a lot in there. Just there we could talk for a long time. I mean, your first point, I think, is a really brilliant point. It's very complex, and as I said, I got into trouble the other day on a podcast because I don't think I explain myself very well. This idea that people who believe themselves to be benevolent can cause evil, because I think the guy who was interviewing me just said, well, journalists are lying, and we need to kind of, these are the bad guys. And I've been a journalist, and this is one of the things that made me write the book, is this question, because I was kind of self-censoring, not lying, but so it's kind of where do we jump into this? I mean, one way of looking at this kind of evolution of truth, I mean, I don't want to get too philosophical with you, but it was a kind of evolution of truth, because the boomers didn't just break journalism, they broke truth, and all these concepts of impartiality, objectivity, they've all been completely kind of almost twisted around, almost today, to mean they're opposites sometimes.
It goes together with this whole trend towards objectivity being what people make of it, right? And new ways of approaching also the study of reality, and which then goes into academia.
Well, look, if you do what the boomers did, which is you smash up the old idea of truth, the old Victorian idea was kind of scientific, so it was all about questioning, and truth is about the right to be skeptical. The Victorians were very, very smart, and it was a bit like Sherlock Holmes. You have to look for evidence. You have to look for all the evidence. You don't just look for things that confirm your prejudices. And then you've got to test your ideas constantly with debate. So it's absolutely 100% essential in a liberal democracy, the Victorians would have said, that you have a different side, that you're constantly hearing other opinions to test your own opinion. You can't have liberal democracy, the Victorian theorists would have said, if everyone agrees. That doesn't make sense. That's not a democracy. That's some sort of totalitarian hell. If you smash up truth, then what happens? Well, you kind of get a vacuum. And what happens is you actually go back. This is the kind of one of the paradoxes. The boomers thought they were doing something radically new and sexy and amazing by smashing up all this old-fashioned Victorian stuff. What the boomers were actually doing wasn't new. They were going back to the pre-Enlightenment way of thinking and way of knowing, which is based on faith. It's based on deference to authority, those in power and authority, almost a kind of magical, perhaps theological way of knowing, which is not based on evidence. It's not based on reason. It's not based on listening and debating and having your ideas challenged. It's much older. It's kind of the default way. And I sum this up again. I call it truthophobia, but it's the reliance on narrative. Human beings are. We have this kind of tendency towards narrative. If I say to you, Pascal, once upon a time, I've kind of hooked you immediately. You want to know what. And so these news narratives, which we used to believe hundreds of years ago, about good and evil, good versus evil, simple, easy to understand stories, tribal stories. This is what the boomers have done. These are the unintended consequences of what they did by smashing up Victorian liberal journalism. They kind of opened the locked box and out came all this tribalism, the worst type of tribalism. That's what they've unlocked. That's what they've given us. This is the inheritance that they've bequeathed us. Tribalism and narrative. And if you've got a world of narrative, then, well, which narratives do you believe? You need to be guided in which narratives to believe, because you're not interested in what's objectively true. You're only interested in what is the kind of good narrative that the good people believe. And those narratives, in the book, I make this distinction between the kind of ordinary journalists who are kind of 90% in the kind of pyramid, and then the top, well, the kind of top 1 or 2% perhaps, which I call the journocrats. These are highly paid people on a great deal of money, perhaps $400,000 a year, £300,000 a year, perhaps. And these are the people who are in charge. They have the power to shape the narratives. Too much power, I think, has ended up in the hands of elite journocrats.
Did you experience that? I mean, you've been working in journalism for about 20 years, right? Did you personally experience that at the BBC?
Yes, of course, everyone does every day, not just at the BBC. If you're a junior journalist, if you're not one of the elite journocrats, and these journocrats, they're kind of quite easy to identify because they're usually designated as correspondent or senior editor or chief editor or bureau chief or something like that. And funnily enough, in the UK, the BBC is required to publish their salaries. And so anyone, this is fact. This is not conspiracy theory. You can check it. You can go to the BBC's annual report and it lists all the people that are paid the big bucks. Scroll down to news and current affairs. Boom, there they are. There are the journocrats earning $400,000 a year. The elite people, they're the people who are able, they have the power to shape the narrative and decide what gets into the news, what doesn't. Now, the job of the everyday journalist, I was kind of mid-ranking journalist at the BBC. I was never at the top. Their job is to come in and on a day-to-day basis, find stories to put into the news that conform to the big narrative. So, for example, there will be news meetings, editorial meetings going on in every newsroom around the world as we speak. And journalists will be sitting around and someone will have the kind of news agenda, the prospects, and they'll be saying, what should we put in the show today? And people will put their hands up and say, I heard this really good story we should be doing. Now, if that story conforms to the narratives, it's going to get in, whether that's about COVID or it's climate or Ukraine or whatever it's about. If, on the other hand, a young journalist says, I've got a good story, I've heard that, and they come out with something that's contrary to the narrative. No, I don't think so. There's social pressure. It's peer group pressure. it's kind of unspoken. It's a process of socialization of young journalists, whose goals are to, as with most people, to impress the boss, get a promotion, prestige, gain professional prestige, advance through the ranks. They just want to do a good job. And most ordinary journalists are ignorant of the kind of big questions. I mean, they're just people. Journalists are just people like you and me. So there's peer group pressure. It's not some sinister conspiracy, where journalists go into work and say, how can I tell lies today? They just go in and do the day job. But the culture in all the newsrooms of official journalism is such that it's extremely difficult. Well, it's completely impossible to come in and say, oh, here's something, that I heard, which shows that, or which suggests that Donald Trump has been telling the truth and he's being persecuted unfairly by the Department of Justice. Oh, okay, maybe. That's just not going to get into the news agenda,
So for me and everybody who listens to this, how would we reverse engineer this? Because we still rely on these sources, and I advocate for reading them because it's important to know what's the official dogma. But how do we properly decode this? So if I read a New York Times article, and then in this article I find some factual description of what happened, and then some narrative control of making it going into one direction, but then I also find a lot of qualifying adjectives which annoy the crap out of me. I don't need the journalist to tell me that this was a steely gaze, or that it was a fiery judgment, or something. Do these adjectives, are they inserted by the journalist? Can I judge that, okay, the journalist is just thought this out, or is this the newsroom that this then peppers this in? Is this a collective endeavor? And also the spin, is it a collective endeavor, or is it more the individual journalist who does that?
Well, it's much worse than you're saying. Because it's not just a question of looking at an article in the New York Times or on BBC and kind of trying to decode it, which, yes, you can do that. We can talk about that. It's much worse because it is what is not being reported. And you can't decode what you're unaware of. And this is the huge problem for democracy, because it results in uninformed and misinformed citizens. I mean, I think the short answer is that that we need to relearn how to be rationally skeptical, and how to think independently, and how to think critically. So those official media channels are fine, but you've got to understand that's just the case, say, for the prosecution. If it was a legal trial, imagine this is a trial, and someone's on trial for murder. First of all, you hear the case for the prosecution. Okay, that's fine. Now, you don't then say, right, that's it, I've heard everything, hang the person, burn them, because they're clearly evil. No, wait, let's hear the other side. Now, the defect, the biggest defect of official journalism is it's one-sided. We just don't get that other side. So the remedy, logically, is, having heard the official version, let's now jump over the fence, climb over the fence, and let's hear another version. So we go to your podcast, Pascal, or we go to numerous other websites where there are highly intelligent, very informed, unofficial journalists giving a different interpretation. And that's, I guess, what you have to do. There's a drawback to that. There's a practical problem. It is effortful. It requires effort. It requires time, and it requires the ability to think critically. And ordinary people don't have that time. And if you're busy working, doing stuff that we all do, you don't have to say, all right, I'm going to come home, I'm going to spend the next 4 hours trying to verify what I heard on the news. The whole point of journalism is that it was invented so that we delegate that job to other people. I could rewire my house if I wanted to. I'm not sure I do a very good job, but if I spent years learning to be an electrician, I could probably do a good job. I haven't got the time to to learn that. And people, we don't have the time to be journalists for ourselves, so we delegate it. We delegate our trust to journalists. I mean, that's another thing, actually, Pascal. Trust is collapsing. I saw some figures a couple of days ago, the latest figures for the BBC's flagship news and current affairs program, which is the Radio 4 Today program. That's the gold standard. And they're hemorrhaging listeners, 12% audience fall off. And according to the latest figures, people I meet just say it's unlistenable to, because they can detect they're intelligent people. We know we're hearing narrative. We know we're hearing one side of it.
Yeah, but this is, to me, that's a good thing. I am glad that trust is collapsing, because it's a fails trust. I tell my students they shouldn't trust me, not because I lie to them, but because I might tell them something that might be wrong and I don't know it. So you need to check me, and the only one who can do it is you. That's the sad matter of the fact, right? So okay, we don't have the time to go into each and every claim and fact check them. And I want to talk about the word fact checking, because fact checking has now been outsourced, right? Or the idea of journalists that can be outsourced. But the issue is that if you trust any kind of authority, you're already halfway into the grave, because you lulled yourself into believing that I can just trust this person. Where also is there's also this big frustration that people might love a certain podcaster or might love a certain news anchor until the news anchor says something that they're not happy with, and then the person is dead to them, dead. And we have trouble with dealing with the fact that people don't always agree with us on every aspect, and that doesn't mean that they're wrong on every other aspect, right? Which goes hand in hand with this idea that democracy, there's a right opinion in democracy and there's a wrong opinion, and people who follow the wrong opinion are misinformed. Therefore, they need the good information. And I think that's where then evil starts appearing in public discourse. You write about that.
Yeah, well, I love your questions. Yeah, I mean, this is the mess we're in, and we're in a terrible mess. And I think, yes, I completely agree with you. And I think that ultimately we get the journalism and we get the government we deserve. We certainly get the journalism we deserve. But the answer is critical thinking. I mean, it's easy. We can just rant and rave about journalists and journocrats, and they're this, they're that, they're liars, they're self-censoring, they're slaves to narrative. That may be true, but maybe we, I mean the audience, I mean citizens, have got to take responsibility for what we believe, and say, yeah, I mean, that's fine. I don't believe everything I hear on the news. And so, yes, it's trying to get back to critical thinking, taking what I call epistemic responsibility, the idea of having liberty of conscience, which again is an old-fashioned Victorian Enlightenment idea that I'm responsible for what I believe, and I'm not a bad person because I believe something different to the official narrative. But you've also touched on something else that is kind of potentially quite tragic. That what people are doing, I mean, not everyone. They're just turning away from the official version to unofficial sources. And so they're only hearing, again, one side. So I said this is a bit like a court case, where official journalism gives you the case for the prosecution and they don't want you to hear the case for the defense. Well, there's a danger maybe that too many of us are kind of going the other way. So you're refusing to hear the case for the prosecution. We're just hearing the case for the defense. And it's becoming terribly tribal. And that's dangerous. Different people believe different facts, and they're not even aware of the other side.
Yeah, but we see how that was also now it's reaching its peak, or it's getting closer to peak, I believe. We saw that in the Corona debate when different interpretations of what's happening were actually criminalized in the sense that you were not allowed to say them, and if you did, you could be made liable. You write about that you write about the Djokovic case. That's exactly that one. We cannot let somebody have a legal right based upon what he believes, right? And then he didn't have the right to play in Australia. That's the example you give. We see this now in Ukraine even more egregiously, where the West and the European Union, they just ban Russia Today. They ban Sputnik. They literally ban the other voice. And a lot of things that are that are telling the story from the Russian side are banned. Scott Ritter just lost his show last week, and others. They are just, they are being purged from YouTube, and YouTube itself can ban any one of us any day without. There's nothing we can do. Nothing. Zero, because terms of agreement, we have no rights, and there's a constant Damocles sword, right? And this is getting worse, and we've seen this also in the Twitter files. How then this is also fueled by government, by officialdom, and officialdom tells us only believe official sources and trust the science, which they which is co-opted in order to then tell the narrative. So this is all spinning into more propaganda from a main central source of information. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, censorship inevitably follows. I mean, this is what the boomers have bequeathed us. It's a poisonous legacy. When you destroy the old journalism, the search, the impartial search for truth, and you think you're doing that for the right reasons because you believe you're good. So you could say that the baby boomer generation and the kind of journocrats, the kind of elite people who are in charge of the news, suffer from the most terrible of all delusions, which is the delusion that they are virtuous and that they have to enforce their truth on us for our own good. Censorship will follow, as it always has done. And if you look at history, typically, for example, the Roman Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, they had a monopoly on information because the only people who could write books, churn out the books, were the monks in the monasteries. They were factories of books. And it wasn't until there was a revolution in communication with the inventing of movable type printing that other people could challenge that monopoly. And so you got the Reformation, because you suddenly got an explosion of new ideas that challenged the power, wealth, and authority of the medieval Catholic Church. And so then the Church responded by having a list of banned books and burning people. You got the Inquisition, you got the Counter-Reformation, cracking down hard on heresy. This is what we're going back to. We're going back to the people in authority and power cracking down on heretical thinking that does not conform to the official narratives. And so it's kind of history repeating itself. We had the internet, we've had an explosion of new ideas and unauthorized thinking. And now what will follow, as sure as night follows day, is censorship and the persecution of heretics.
But the strange thing that you're pointing out is that this is born not as a counter reaction to, but as a logical next step to rebelling against authority, right? Rebelling against the idea that I have to give both sides of an argument and that we have objective truth. The rebelling against this doesn't lead back to censorship, but leads into censorship. That's the argument, right?
We're in one hell of a mess, and we don't, I think, have any perspective, and that's what my book tries to do. I try to step back from the whole thing and see where we are in terms of history, a bit like a overview. We're in one hell of a mess. Censorship follows inevitably. Yeah, I think we have destroyed all the restraints. So that's what the baby boomer generation was fighting against. They were fighting against all the restraints, all these they wanted to have a great time. I call it the vortex of immaturity. They were immature. This enormous tribe of young people who thought they knew everything and wanted to have a great time, and they just saw that all this affluence around them in the last third of the 20th century. And so they want to get rid of all the rules, all the restraints that were holding them back. But it's released demons and it's taken us back. They thought they were going forward. The word progressive, yeah, they thought, yeah, let's be progressive. Let's bring in social change. Let's go forward to boomertopia, create this better world. What they did by destroying the restraints was open the gates of hell. And we've got the worst type of tribalism, authoritarianism coming, rule by a kind of elite oligopoly, aristocracy. Yeah, we're plunging back to the era of prior to the Renaissance, prior to the Enlightenment. But at the same time, we have futuristic technologies, AI, and all these other technologies. Try and imagine the Inquisition of late medieval Europe with AI and facial recognition and the power to control. It is quite scary, isn't it?
The funny thing is, there's people who predicted this. I mean, George Orwell wrote his fantastic book in 1948. He said it a little bit too early, but he was not a boomer. He was pre-boomer, and somehow there was a feeling about like how a society like this could come about. Do you have any theory of how it is that this pre-boomer generation could have these dystopian views of what the future might hold? Did they see it coming? Was there something already in the 20s and 30s?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, George Orwell, yeah, he's uncannily accurate. I don't think he realized he was writing an instruction manual. In the book I write about the contrast between the war generation, who were the parents of the baby boomers, and at the time of I've gone back to primary sources, and I've written, found lots of people at the time in the late 1960s and the early 1970s who were horrified at what the baby boomers were doing, and they likened it often to fascism. They used that word. People like Jürgen Habermas, who was a left-wing socialist German theorist, he referred to what the boomers were doing as the fascism of the left. And there were a number of people who used that word because it was this kind of tribalism. It was all about the boomer tribe, all kind of united, all singing together, imagining a better future. And that horrified the war generation because they'd lived through it. They'd seen totalitarianism, the fascists under Mussolini in Italy, and of course in Germany. They witnessed it. They'd fought against it, and they defeated it, and it absolutely horrified them. They also were clever enough to see it wasn't just kind of literally kind of fascism. It had perhaps more in common with a kind of barbarianism. And one of my favorite writers is Kenneth Clark, who wrote a wonderful book called Civilization, and it was a series. It was a series, a kind of art history series on the BBC. And people think of that today as just a kind of rather old-fashioned show about art history. Well, it wasn't. It was an impassioned plea to kind of respect the fruits of Western civilization. And he absolutely saw the baby boomer generation as the barbarians at the gates of Rome, about to destroy civilization. He was under no doubt. And if you look at the first episode or the beginning of his book, and especially the last episode, where he kind of reflects on how close we are to losing civilization, because civilization is fragile. It's much, much more fragile than we believe. And yeah, it's quite scary. And he ends, Kenneth Clark ends by saying it's possible to be optimistic, but it's it's impossible to be joyful about the prospect before us.
On the other hand, on a more positive note, we see also that people are thirsty for trustworthy information. They want to know, and that's also why alternative media is flourishing, right? And they want to think, they want to engage. That's why podcasts like these actually get listeners. That's why Joe Rogan gets listeners. That's why Tucker Carlson gets listeners, because these people don't necessarily report what's happening, but they help intellectually digesting what's going on, and there's a thirst for that, right? So the whole notion that people are dumb and just need to be channeled the right information in order to do that, that's at least not for the entire population true, right? There's a big part of the population that actually really thirsts for more help, intellectual and with the news. Who can I trust? Isn't that something to build upon? Shouldn't there be an entire market? And there is a market, right, for trustful, good information.
Yes, well, that's just brilliantly put, Pascal. That's absolutely right. And I think if there is hope, I suspect it will be generational hope. I think hope will come from young people, because when I talk to young people, the kind of ideology, which I refer to as the official ideology and its narratives and so on, they don't buy into that. They see that as something that their parents and grandparents believe in, and I see them quietly cynical about the whole thing. I think they tend to keep quiet, but I think there is an appetite for the truth. And for the other side, and I think you've used a great metaphor. This idea of being hungry, because it is very much like food. If you served a meal every night, and it might be a nice sugary meal, a nice tempting, easy meal of ice cream and French fries and burgers. Oh yeah, that sounds great. If you have that every day for every meal every week, you're just going to think, I just want something else. I can't describe it. I just kind of want a vegetable, So it's kind of within us, this kind of need, this epistemic vigilance. It's referred to by psychologists, this kind of inbuilt need, this inbuilt ability we have to detect, like a radar, that something's wrong, and that we're only getting half the story, and there's something missing, and that our journalism is broken, that the information, that we're being sold something. And so, you can't destroy it. And that's why people are turning more and more to, you mentioned Tucker Carlson and your show and hundreds and hundreds of other shows. Yes, there is demand for what is being left out, and for a different narrative, a different point of view. May not be right, it may be wrong, but we got to hear both sides, haven't we? Just as in if we're the jury, I just want to hear both sides. I don't want a situation where we're going to, give this person a really quick trial and then a really quick hanging. No, I don't want that. I want to hear the one side, and then I want to hear the other. And most important of all, I want the right, my human right as an individual to make up my own mind after hearing and listening to both sides. That's what I want.
So one question, or two questions. I'm pretty sure we can't answer them conclusively. But first, what is your recommendation? What to do when the right to judge is taken away from us, like during the COVID pandemic? Or as we are seeing now with a lot of the political actions that are going on around around climate change, where a lot of decisions are indoctrinated from the top. And if you don't go along, it will hurt you. And during the pandemic, we had that, right? If you were not willing to take the vaccine, you would have to personally suffer. What's your recommendation to this one? Second question, sorry, just a lot. what's your recommendation to deal with the fact that sometimes we disagree with people, even the ones that we highly respect? My example, I am skeptical toward the whole climate change narrative because it is a narrative, and my alarm bells went off. I'm not a climate scientist, but if everybody tells me I need to believe a certain narrative, I get highly suspicious. I get this allergic reaction, and my climate bell, my warning signs went off. But I also have this brilliant politician in Europe, Claire Daly, whom I love dearly, and she's very, very outspoken against the Ukraine war. She's a humanist. She's a very good person, and she's also very much, we need to take care of the climate. The climate crisis is here and everything. So there's just something to disagree with. But what is, and my reaction is, okay, I accept that she has a different opinion than mine on this one. Do you have a recipe for people to deal with disagreement? Okay, sorry about the two big questions, but no, please.
No. Well, I love your questions. They're amazing. I think there are at least 3 questions in there, actually, Pascal. But just one thing, I think, as a kind of aside, because these things are really complex, and they're a lot of people, we're kind of assuming, aren't we, in this whole conversation, that people want to hear the truth, and that isn't necessarily true itself. A lot of people either want to have their own beliefs confirmed, which we refer to, of course, as confirmation bias, or else, and I come across this quite a lot, that people kind of want to just be told what they ought to believe, because if the goal is to be a good person, we want to be thought of as ethically, politically good, and if someone's telling us, well, you should believe these things, you ought to believe them, a lot of people will say, okay, that's great. Well, that's what I'm going to convince myself is true. So, that's a whole other kind of area. But look, let's assume that there are people, hopefully the majority of people, I would like to think, who really do want to know what's true and not just what they ought to believe, to conform. And I think probably my kind of brief answer is that we have to take epistemic responsibility. As I think I said earlier, it's very easy for us just to sit here and be lazy and blame journalists and blame journalism and blame corruption and blame all these things on other people. But we've got to take responsibility. I have, you have, everyone listening to this podcast. We have to take epistemic responsibility for what we believe. And so we do have to make an effort. I don't see any way out of that. If we want to live in a free, self-governing liberal democracy, we have to work at it. We can't just be lazy and go off and watch the next Barbie movie and not. Yeah, we have to. There's no way around it. We have to say, I'm going to have to spend a little bit of time every day listening to both sides. You said in your question, you talked, I think, about COVID. The information was there. You didn't actually have to listen to extreme conspiracy channels. People were able, it's very easy, and I did this myself, to go and look at the data that was published by Pfizer, the pharmaceutical companies, published details of their own clinical trials. Now, the media, in the case of COVID, I remember went kind of crazy and hysterical that said the vaccines were 98% effective. And all I did was I looked at the clinical data. I'm not a doctor, but I'm, reasonably intelligent. And I looked at it carefully. And I looked at an article in the Lancet. I think it was the Lancet, which is, highly respected academic medical journal. And they pointed out that the 98% figure, although it was true, referred to relative risk reduction. And if you used a different figure, a different metric, which was absolute risk reduction, then the efficacy of those vaccines was less than 1%. So that for me was a bit of a, oh, really? And then I did a bit of research. So it's not about, listening to crazy conspiracy channels. It's about taking responsibility and spending time and effort and questioning. But we've got to rediscover truth. We've got to fall back in love with truth. We've got to stop demonizing people who say things that are different. And that was the I think the third of your questions. What happens if someone that we respect says something which we believe to be not true? Fine, good. I mean, I don't want I start to get suspicious and bored if someone agreed with me all the time. I want to have my beliefs challenged because I might be wrong. I'm just, at the end of the day, I'm just a human. I'm just a weak, fallible human like every other human being, So yeah, we need to fall back in love with debate, get rid of this hubris that we have. And that we think that experts, highly paid experts are right and have some sort of secret knowledge. Generally, they don't. We have to get back in love with critical thinking. But
yeah, and it's a hallmark of propaganda when an authority starts telling you that the subject matter is so complicated that only the fewest of the few and the brightest of the brights have the ability to understand it because they can read Latin or whatever it is, and you just then need to take their word for it because they are Dr. XYZ at Columbia or what's not. That's just an argument by authority, which is by default invalid. But it's a hallmark, and that's why it makes me, especially all of these moments when a narrative is created to justify why, ladies and gentlemen, all of us must now do X because Mr. Y said so. And all of us, if not all of us, do the same thing, then we're all gonna die. That's those narratives, they get me like goosebumps. It's like they keep creeping up. Like every generation has a couple of those. The Cold War was all about, if you were in the West, it was all about defeating communism. If we don't all fight now, then tomorrow we're dead. COVID, if we don't all do the thing, then we're all dead. If we don't all stop eating meat, we're all dead. And it's like, but I guess that's also then where the skepticism again comes from, right? People who just don't buy it. Now, do you have a way of do you have another way or some other metric or rule of thumb to say like, okay, something makes more sense to me than other things?
Well, you've touched on another brilliant point, which is fear. If you're trying to manipulate a group of people, if you're trying to manipulate the human herd or any herd of animals, create fear and panic, because then we don't have time to think. And we're also less tolerant of people saying, hang on a sec, let's just stop and think. No, we haven't got time. It's an emergency. We're all going to die. We're in terrible danger. There's going to be a catastrophe. And yeah, I'm very suspicious of anyone who tries to create fear. So I think you're absolutely right about that. There's a great video, you can see it on YouTube, by the late great Richard Feynman, the wonderful American scientist, giving a lecture in the 1960s about what science actually is, because we seem to have completely lost what science is. We today just kind of worship the doctrine of certain selected scientists, and he says that science is the right to doubt, and he says it's nothing to do with experts. He says it doesn't matter what credentials you have, it doesn't matter how clever you are, doesn't matter how important you are. If what you're saying doesn't conform to reality, you're wrong. And it's a great video, but perhaps people can try and find that. But yeah, it's the kind of the fallacy of authority and this idea that do I have any solutions to it? Well, no, I think just what we've been talking about. Ultimately we kind of needed some sort of counter revolution. Because to me, all this went wrong. When the boomer generation had a revolution about how we think, and it's led us into a dead end. It's leading us down hill towards the edge of a cliff. So we need some sort of cognitive, cultural counter-reformation. We need to rediscover some of the good things that existed before the boomer generation came along, and that includes debate. We've got to fall back in love with listening to the other side of the argument. We shouldn't be frightened of that. We should respect each other's opinions and beliefs, just as during the Enlightenment they gave religious belief to everyone. It doesn't mean you know, if you're a Catholic, you don't have to agree with Protestants. You may absolutely be 100% certain they're wrong and that they're going to hell, but you must tolerate them and allow them to believe what they believe, and then they believe, let you believe the same. What you mustn't do is start burning each other, and that's the path we're on.
Yeah, but there's the argument on the liberal side that you cannot tolerate intolerance, which is another gateway to hell, I believe. Did you see that in your own work? You know, this idea that, okay, no, we love all different perspectives, but not this one.
Yeah, when you say my work, do you mean the book, or are you talking about when I was a journalist?
Your work as a journalist. Did you come across this yourself?
Well, the idea of not tolerating evil, of course, that's an age-old kind of primitive tribal human belief, and it was exactly that the European and the Anglo-American Enlightenment set out to fight. And you get it's summed up in Voltaire, the quote attributed to Voltaire that, I disagree with you completely, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. And it was the boomers. I write about this in the book. There's a chapter on Marcuse, who wrote a book about what he called repressive tolerance. He turned it back to front, and he was a great hero of the boomers. He said, "Oh, this is tolerance. This is awful. We mustn't tolerate bad stuff." And that kind of was music to the boomers. They didn't want to tolerate stuff that wasn't helpful to them. When I was a journalist, I think I self-censored. And I think all journalists self-censor. And I think that self-censorship is reaching epidemic proportions. You self-censor. Journalists very rarely stop and talk about these things or even think about them, because they're just too busy doing the job, and they're socialized into the culture of the newsroom. And you just learn, like you learn in any job. Oh yeah, well, we do these things, we don't do these things. You never say that. We always try and say that. I think if journalists did stop and were forced to kind of look in the mirror and say, why didn't you report that? And why did you report that in that way? Why are you self-censoring? They would probably say, well, because I have an ethical, political responsibility to make the world a better place. And that's what we've been talking about. And that's what the book's about, because when you go down that road, it sounds reasonable. What's wrong with making the world a better place? Well, nothing. But when there are unforeseen and unintended consequences when you put social justice first, and when truth becomes second. I should say, actually, journalists. A lot of journalists would kind of take issue with this. They would say, well, we do tell the truth. Look here, this is a truth. This is a truth. This is a truth. But it's putting truth in second place. I think journalists are very happy to tell the truth, provided it doesn't conflict with the prime goal, which is to make the world a better place. Then they have to choose, right, okay, so then these things happen.
Yeah, let's remember, I don't think people burned witches men burned witches because they hated women. They burned witches because they believed they had to protect the group from the evil witchery that they were doing. The sad thing is they were wrong. They were no witches. So you ended up killing all of these innocent people, and we keep doing that again and again. And you look at the narrative right now about Ukraine, right? We have to send all of these weapons and kill as many Russians as we can in order to be good people. And it's fantastic how these same mechanisms work time and again every century. And your book is doing a good job at trying to point out the role that generations play in generational like perception and then experiences. So I recommend everybody getting a copy of the book, Graham Majin, with Truthophobia. Graham, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.